And finally, I would also like to welcome and thank our members for your support and participation. If any of you in the audience are not yet members and you do enjoy this morning's program, we hope that you will consider joining us. Our next program is coming up on August 26th. It is an evening at the 49ers camp with Jed York, the President and CEO of the San Francisco 49ers. He will be talking about technology, the future of technology in sports, innovations in the new stadium, and much more. The attendees of this program will also have an opportunity to watch the 49ers practice, and I'm told if Coach Singletary does not engage them in a nutcracker exercise, that they will also come over and socialize with our attendees. This will be a members-only event. And my last announcement, if you are going to be tweeting this morning, please use #Churchill Club so that everyone can follow along. And you can also check in on Foursquare at Churchill Club at Fenwick and West. And so now I'm very pleased to introduce Tracy Lefteroff. Tracy is the Global Managing Partner for Life Sciences at PwC, and he leads the charge to provide services to life sciences companies worldwide. Recently, he's been involved in some very significant M&A activity. He is certainly well qualified to lead our panel discussion this morning, and we're very much looking forward to the fresh perspectives and insights that he and our panel will deliver to us this morning. So please join me in welcoming Tracy Lefteroff.
Thank you, Karen. I think we're got a stellar panel this morning to talk about a topic that has been in the news very frequently over the last year and a half, healthcare reform. And before we get started, let me just introduce the panel. Well, first, immediately here on my left is David Gollaher, who is the CEO of the California Healthcare Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes and lobbies for the life sciences industry in California, a very worthwhile organization in our space, in our industry. And then we have Paul Tang, who is with the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, and Paul is really a healthcare information technology expert and is in charge of all the IT systems at Palo Alto Medical Foundation, which is also somebody that's going to be impacted by this legislation. And then we have Tom Novelli from the Medical Device Manufacturers Association, which is a nonprofit group that basically is an industry organization for small, medium, and large medical device companies. And so we welcome all three of you. We appreciate the time that you've donated to this cause to examine this topic. And to kick it off, I'd like to ask each of the panels, maybe we could start with David and Paul and Tom, to just give us a general, personal viewpoint of, the healthcare reform legislation, and then we'll dive into some more specifics about the legislation, but just like your general views of what you think of the bill and its impact. David?
So I have an ambivalent view of the bill in the sense that I think that it took on one very important thing, which is expanding coverage to most U.S. citizens. In a country as rich as ours, with 50 million people without insurance, that's something that certainly needs to be addressed on the level of a social issue. By the same token, though, the bill never really addressed the underlying structural problems in American medicine, the main drivers of cost. So my worry is that those will have to be addressed sometime during the next few years, and it may happen in a much less thoughtful and much more reactive way. So I'm concerned that the bill doesn't address the underlying cost problems in American medicine, particularly in the Medicare program.
I also view that it's clear it was an insurance reform bill and not a overall health reform bill. But I think accomplishing that was a huge accomplishment, certainly politically, and puts us on the track to do full comprehensive health reform. As David said, really addressing one of our biggest deficits in health policy in this country and helping us to catch up with the other developed countries in the world is to deal with the problems of insurance. I do think it starts to address the cost problem in a very important way. So one, uninsurance there was an Institute of Medicine report talking about an insurance, and that's a shared destiny. It truly is. So one, from an overall societal cost point of view, not having access, not having insurance causes increased costs down the road. You don't have access to preventive services, you don't get care on an ongoing basis, so you can prevent some of the complications. So that's a net loss to society. The other way it impacts all of us is that in a shared destiny way, there's cost shifting that has to go to pay for this. So that's another important point. The part that's not probably talked about a lot is the Massachusetts experiment with this when they started years ago, and the result. So none of us, I think, in healthcare think that we have a good design. It's a poor design. It has perversity through and through, and it's just not going to allow people to move forward. So by shining a brighter light, and what I mean is by increasing coverage and having more demand, more people have access, we will shine a brighter light on the perversity of the current system. That, I think, in itself will bring the crisis, bring the U.S. into crisis mode sooner than would have otherwise have happened. So I think actually, one, politically, this was the only thing that could be accomplished. It's one of the grand goals to have universal coverage, and it will bring, I think, the true reform closer in. Another thing that we'll probably talk about later is we actually have a sequence of events. So the Recovery Act in 2009, a huge section of that was called high-tech, and that really incent people to accelerate the placing of the appropriate infrastructure, the electronic infrastructure, the information infrastructure into place. We can't do the reform, can't even start the reform before that electronic infrastructure takes place. So for a number of reasons, I think this was a very important and very concrete step in the right direction.
Tom?
Sure. Well, this really started on an upward incline. The legislation, this really had its roots going back 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and every time since then. Really incentivized, really grandiose idea of universal coverage, and I think we're all in agreement that that's something that should eventually be achieved. I think we're all, some of us are in disagreement on how exactly do we get there. This, at the end of the day, started off as some very good ideas, some very concrete ideas. Started off in a very, for the most part, within specific committees of legislation, very, bipartisan ideas that we want, affordable care, we want access to care, and the end result, unfortunately, at least the methodology to get there, is something that I think was of concern to many people. The fact that this bill was passed by 3 votes in the House of Representatives, the fact that there really wasn't any bipartisanship in the final bill. For something as dramatic as the change that we're about to see over the course of the next 10 years, the fact that this wasn't done in a bipartisan manner, politically speaking, was something that was, in my personal opinion, unfortunate. Getting to the questions of whether this actually addresses the costs, one of the underlying concerns is this, there is a question of does this bend the cost curve? From the medical device perspective industry, we're dealing with new challenges going forward, starting in 2012, going on 2013, the imposition of a new device tax and other problems and other issues. We're looking at ourselves and our responsibility in the system and saying, as a business, as an industry that tries to encourage innovation, that tries to develop some of these ideas, are incentives in place to continue this innovation, to bring these life-saving technologies into the marketplace. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of disincentives included in this legislation, which we'll probably get into in a little bit.
Just to follow up on your remarks, Tom, before we move to some other questions, the Bay Area has a very vibrant and extensive medical device community. And I know one of the concerns when I talk to clients and CEOs out there is what impact is this bill going to have on the medical device industry specifically, not only small companies but also some of the emerging what I would call middle tier companies as well as some of the large ones. Could you maybe share your views on that with us?
Sure. Well, I'll just talk a few highlights of specific provisions within the legislation that are affecting medical device companies, life science companies, not only in the Bay Area, but everywhere. First, as I mentioned, the imposition of a new device tax. This was sought out early on. Let me step back a minute. One of the goals of this legislation, eventually, politically, was to keep the total price tag of the bill under $1 trillion to make sure that it was paid for when looked at by the Congressional Budget Office. So one of the pay-fors that they suggested was a $40 billion device tax, or in the initial phase, it was actually a fee to be assessed based on your market, based on the share of your markets for your specific device. Say you're in orthopedics, you have X% of the marketplace, you will pay a fee for this much per year in order to help fund healthcare reform. And the initial rationale behind this was that, well, you're going to have increased beneficiaries using your products, therefore this will be a wash. You might have to pay a little bit more than you would, but at the end of the day, you'll be benefiting. And we're sitting to ourselves, we're asking our member companies, does this make sense? Are you going to have this windfall? Do you think you're going to have this windfall profit margin or what have you? They looked at states like Massachusetts where there's near universal coverage, and we haven't really seen much of an uptake within that system. We hope it's better if this is what we're going to be forced to deal with. But you have to look at the actual diversity of the medical device market, and I think this is where really legislators lost sight in crafting this legislation. For instance, we had one of our companies who makes external cardiac defibrillators. You go into a hospital or you go into, you see them in airports, and if you suddenly go into cardiac arrest, you have to get zapped. And we had one of our member companies saying, how is this going to benefit us? This windfall of new patients. And they went into their legislator's office and looked them straight in the eye and said, honestly, do we think that the cases of sudden cardiac arrest are going to increase because of this legislation? If an uninsured,
It's possible.
it might be possible, but if you're a 50-year-old man who's uninsured and and you go into a hospital with cardiac arrest, you will receive treatment. The question was, how do you redistribute the resources that hospitals expend for that uninsured care? I mean, those capital equipment purchases are still being made regardless. So this idea that there's going to be a windfall profit doesn't necessarily add up. So after kind of months of going back and forth, what happened was what was included in the original Senate legislation and what was ultimately passed by the House was an excise tax of 2.3%, not based on profit, but based on total revenue. So within the life science industry, you can be a kind of a small company and have $75 million to $100 million in annual revenue and still not be profitable. Because keep in mind, it takes a significant amount of resources from venture capital, from other equity firms to bring your product to the market. So we have companies that, quite honestly, are $90 million in annual revenue, still are not profitable yet, but are going to be paying a 2.3% excise tax starting in 2013. And they're looking to themselves, and along with other factors that they have dealing with the FDA and other issues, where's the incentive to innovate right now? If we're going to be paying out more in taxes on this, for the specific excise tax for healthcare reform, if we're dealing with these challenges we have now at the FDA, where's our incentive to innovate? And the medical device industry in this country is one of the few that's actually be considered manufacturing that still is growing, that still is something that's very uniquely American. It's one of the few industries where we actually have a net positive trade export of $5.2 billion per year. So at the end of the day, we were stuck with a 2.3% excise tax, no provisions for exemptions for smaller companies, and that was probably one of the critical areas. One of the other issues, and this is something that was kind of partial to me, because I used to work in the U.S. Senate on the Finance Committee for Chuck Grassley, and during my time there, I did investigations into kind of company interactions with medical device companies and physicians, drug pharmaceutical companies and physicians, and what we did was create legislation at the time that would require the disclosure of payments made by manufacturers to physicians, because you go into a doctor's office and you see the cups with pharmaceutical labels on it and everything else, And while you can come to your own conclusions on whether or not these types of gifts or whatnot lead to an inducement of prescribing habits. What the legislation now creates is that any payments, most payments that are made by manufacturers to physicians, whether for consulting purposes, whether for training purposes, etc., do have to be reported in a new federal database. Now, the only problem with this, at least we saw, is that the threshold level, for a medical device manufacturer to describe or to consult with, a physician who's helping develop the product, because they oftentimes have the most know-how. You can fly a physician out to your facility, you can train them how to use your product, all at fair market value, nothing really extraordinary, but this will have to be, those types of payments will have to be reported. The threshold level, however, is set so low that you're going to get a lot of static noise at the end of the day. For instance, any payment over $10 or $10 or more has to be reported. So if you take a doctor out to talk about a product and he has a very big triple mocha frappuccino and exceeds $10, that will have to be reported, and patients can go in and they can look up their doctor and they can see this is what my doctor's been receiving. And I think from a doctor's perspective, at least some of the ones we've talked to, they're worried about patients drawing the wrong conclusions about what could have been an educational information session about their product. They may think that there's some sort of shenanigans going on or what have you. But those are two of the kind of front burner issues we're dealing with, and as well as some others.
Yeah, before we get into IT, because I want to explore that, David, I know that a couple part question here. I know you've been working with the biotech industry on a couple of different fronts. Number one, I'm curious as to what impact you think this will have on biotech companies, and then also part of this legislation addressed the biosimilars, or the discussion around it was around biosimilars, which is generic biologics for those of you that may not be familiar with the term. And you'd like to find out where do you think we ended up there in the legislation, and what impact is that going to have? So two-part question.
It's a good question, Tracy. Those of you who follow this probably know that Is this better? Yes. This work?
There you go.
Okay, thank you. The pharmaceutical industry, through their trade association, Pharma, actually supported the bill. And according to the New York Times and other sources, that probably cost the pharma CEO his job. They have a new CEO now. One of the things that the pharmaceutical industry put on the table early on was an $80 billion in discounts over a 10-year period that would do a number of things. For example, close the so-called donut hole in the Medicare prescription drug benefit. But by and large, I think if you talk to both pharma and to bio, you see fairly broad support for what was in the legislation. I think there was a thought that the markets would expand to some degree and that there would be more coverage. Within that, to Tracy's second part of this question, one of the provisions that's more esoteric but very important if you're a biotech CEO is follow-on biologics, or so-called biosimilars legislation. In the past, the FDA had no authority to approve, if you will, generic versions of biotech drugs that were going off patent. And there was a lot of discussion over the last several years in Congress about what that pathway would look like. You can imagine that the largest biotech companies were resistant to the idea of knockoff products of theirs being made. Long story short, the provisions in the healthcare reform bill granted long enough periods of data exclusivity for innovator companies to win returns or get returns on their investments. Also opened the door, though, to companies making second and third generation versions of biologics. I think overall the industry felt it was a victory and served both the goals of creating generic versions of these expensive drugs and preserving incentives that were adequate for new investment reasons.
Great, thanks. Paul, you mentioned that the healthcare reform bill included a section called high tech in there, and again, a two-part question here. Number one is what impact do you think that's going to have on improving patient care and moving healthcare reform forward? And then also there was a $273 billion provision in there to provide incentives for organizations to, demonstrate meaningful use of information technology in their businesses. And so if you could explain that provision, because I think there's some confusion as to what meaningful use really means and how's that going to impact, the adoption. And just, from my observation, working with physicians for many, many years, they're very resistant to adopting any kind of new technology, let alone information technology in the way they operate. They're like many of us, they get into routines and how they work, and they're very resistant to adopt new technology, unlike the Apple users in the Bay Area who seem to rush to the store to buy the newest devices out there. Doctors seem to be the opposite. And so tell us how IT is going to work in that environment also.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. Going back up to the 30,000 feet level, the primary goal is to improve the health of individuals and the population. If we focus on that, like any other business or endeavor, you got to have information to go to do that, to understand where you are and to get where you're going to go. In healthcare, paradoxically, we have not had the benefit of computerized information. So less than 10% of the practicing physicians or the hospitals have what we consider to be comprehensive electronic medical record systems. That's just, so if you think about the lives at stake, the medical errors at stake, it's just routine in a paper-based system. So one of the first pieces we have to do, and as I said, that started with the Recovery Act, in this high-tech provision of the Recovery Act, to provide incentives. Now, it was $27 billion. I wish it was $233 billion, but $27 billion. But it's interesting that that $27 billion, the $2.5 trillion industry, is a tail wagging the dog. It has had tremendous impact on both the vendor and the provider community. Why? Now, you did mention that docs have been reluctant in the past, and that definitely was true. Definitely true 5 years ago, perhaps even 3 years ago. I'll give Apple some credit for actually introducing mobile technology that improves their life, whether it's their personal life, and I think in the very short future will be their professional life as well. But clearly the folks coming out of residency right now will go to practices or hospitals that use the technology. You can't anymore because you never could, and it's just now known that you can't practice without information. So they seek out those places, healthcare organizations. But there's been a lot of challenges for physicians to get there. One, the market isn't full of outstanding products, and part of it is sort of a chicken and egg kind of thing. You have to have the demand to create the supply, and the demand wasn't there. But now everyone is realizing that you have to have it, and now how do we get over the hurdles that still remain? So there's the challenge of the products, there's the challenge of the workforce to implement these products and to train physicians and clinical staff to use them and to get the meaningful use out of it. So what's meant there is there's this incentive program, and it is not a cash for clunkers program. In other words, you don't have to do one act and collect your money. You might think, well, this has to do with software, and you say, well, why don't you just buy the software, install it, here's your money to do that. This was a smart move by Congress to say, no, you don't get it if you just buy the software. You have to meaningfully use the software. And that's where the tail wagging the dog comes in. So our goal, the administration's goal, the Congress's goal, was to get better outcomes for the population. And to do that, they felt you needed these information technology tools. So to qualify for the incentive, you had to install it and derive benefits that can be proven on your population of patients. So some of the things you have to measure and report, currently it's a measure and report kind of thing. In the future, so it's a program that extends out through 2015 and beyond. But you must, by the end of this program, so there'll be threshold criteria that become more stringent over time, you must actually, we anticipate you'll be asked to show that you record and improve the health status of the communities you serve. That's never been done before. We've been paid on transactions. We've never been paid on results. So that's where I think we're going, and the fact that the criteria for collecting this financial incentive for installing and adopting and meaningful use using these systems, I think points us in the right direction for achieving results that mean something to individuals in the population.
Great, great. You know, Tom, you know, one of the things about the medical device industry is it's heavily dependent on venture capital, you know, for company formation and bringing these products to market. You know, in your opinion, you know, what impact is this going to have on the venture capital industry, which is, you know, very, you know, vibrant part of the economy here in Silicon Valley. In fact, over half the venture firms in the United States are located within, you know, 10-mile radius here. So
Yeah, a lot of our member companies too. We tend to think of the interaction between medical technology companies, medical device companies, and venture capitalists as kind of existing in this innovation ecosystem where, you know, you have, on one hand, you have, you know, one part of the equation is, you know, the rules, the regulations, the laws that govern, you know, pretty much everything. The other is the ideas that are coming out from, whether it's spinning off from tech transfer, whether it's a former engineer at Medtronic or a large company that's coming up with an idea, or just, for instance, maybe a mechanical engineer who comes up with a really innovative design for a new product. And venture capitalists are kind of, I don't want to say the gatekeepers, but they're looking at all these factors. They're looking at the environment, they're looking at the climate and saying, does it make sense for me to invest in this potential opportunity, and will there be a positive ROI on that on that investment? So they're looking, you know, they look at the products, for instance, medical technologies, intellectual property. We'll look at, you know, the pending legislation. Is that a favorable environment? If this product is infringed upon, is it going to affect potential damages awarded on this project? They're looking at the FDA right now. They're saying, is the regulatory pathway clear? Is it predictable? Do we know whether or not it makes sense? Now, they're also looking at healthcare reform and the impact on that. And they're looking at a couple different features. Number one, they're looking at the medical device tax. You know, while it's not scheduled to go into effect until 2013, there's still uncertainty in whether, you know, there's going to be a push for a small business provision included, whether there's going to be complete repeal of the actual device tax, which is less likely than a slight modification to it. They're looking at issues like comparative effectiveness research, and for those of you who may not be familiar with that, you know, the kind of 30,000-foot overview is that, you know, we want to look at what technologies work best. We want to look at what treatments work best. For instance, for hypertension, what works best? Is it a strict regimen of drugs? Is it lifestyle changes? Is it potentially a medical device? And I say that because we have a medical device that's looking to treat hypertension for those who cannot control it. And that's really, I would say, one of the big uncertainties right now in the venture community with regard to healthcare reform is, you know, we have better understanding what the device tax, you know, could be. There's a lot more uncertainty on the actual comparative effectiveness research. They're asking questions about, you know, how are these studies going to be ultimately designed? Are the comparative effectiveness studies going to be looking at drugs versus devices? Are they going to be looking at drugs versus drugs? Are they going to be looking at drugs versus lifestyle changes? For instance, one of the practical issues I think with a medical technology is, you know, if, say, a comparative effectiveness study takes about 3 years to complete, you're gathering data from, you know, post-market studies, et cetera. What happens is the average lifespan of a medical device is about 18 months on average, give or take. And by the time some of these comparative effectiveness studies are done, you know, that medical device, that generation of the medical device may be not obsolete, but may not be as effective as the next iteration. And whenever I've talked to people up on the Hill, and I always, you know, I'll whip out the iPhone and say, you know, my iPhone 3G is a lot slower than the iPhone 4G, and I got this 12 months ago. So are you going to look at effectiveness of, you know, of the iPhone 3G, even though there's a more advanced version available? That seems to kind of resonate with them a little better than trying to explain a medical device. But at the end of the day, those are some of the hard questions that venture capitalists are looking at right now. And it's really impacting their decision. We've seen the venture community kind of step away from the industry slightly, actually rather significantly, over the last year and a half. And that's really obviously the overall economic climate, but also looking at some of the uncertainties of healthcare reform. and more recently also the FDA.
Okay, great, Tom. You know, David, I know that you, with your organization, have a presence in Washington, D.C., and are there quite frequently, and I'm just wondering, you know, there's a lot of buzz in the press right now about the elections coming up in the fall of 2010, and the, you know, potential for the Republicans to gain control of both the House and the Senate again. I'm just wondering, you know, what impact do you think that would have on healthcare reform, and certainly the implementation of that? As we know, the rules are still, you know, being written as we speak and will be over the next year. And, you know, if there's a change of control here, what impact is that going to have on this? And do you think there's even a possibility that this could be repealed?
So there, particularly among the Tea Partiers and so forth, one of the animating ideas was that we could repeal healthcare reform, and it was really a lightning rod issue in the streets. I think realistically, to repeal the legislation, because the president would certainly veto any repeal, you'd need 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate, and that's not going to happen. The House and the Senate are certainly in doubt in terms of control. We don't know what's going to happen in the elections. The House is up for grabs for sure, and some modeling shows that the Senate may be at risk for the Democrats as well. But I think, Tracy, to your point, that how the legislation is implemented, the devil really is in the details. And if either house is controlled by the Republicans, it would certainly slow down implementation in the first instance. And some issues, for example, the medical device tax, could be reopened. So I think that we have lots of potential for chaos. And nothing like a smooth road going forward. You saw this, I think, just recently. You know, it's been sort of 3 or 4 years since we had the head of Medicare and the president in a recess appointment named Don Berwick, who's a professor at Harvard, and someone who has a long history in medical quality and so forth, a very well-respected scholar and physician, to be the head of Medicare. And the reason it was a recess appointment because the president didn't want him subjected to Senate hearings. He felt that would open up all the wounds of healthcare reform and would dominate the news cycle at a time where the White House had to focus on other things. So I think we're still in a hyper-partisan period. Healthcare reform and its implementation after the fall elections will still be very much part of that. Hard to predict, though.
All right, great. You know, I wanted to drill down a little bit on a comment that Tom made, and this is a question actually for you, Paul. But, you know, Tom mentioned that patients now will be able to go in and see, because of information technology that's now available, what contributions have been made to their doctors. And so, you know, it brings up a relevant question as to what is the patient's role in the healthcare information technology space, and, you know, what impact is that going to have?
It's a good question, Tracy. Maybe it also addresses another point of Tom's, which is sort of from the VC point of view. I think the biggest demographic factor is basically the baby boomers, and I'm one of those. And when we appear on the scene beginning next year, we'll all be here 2030. And when we arrive, which will double the population, the mature population that is Medicare eligible population, it'll double in size from 37 to 70 million people. To put that in perspective, that means you've been to the state of Florida. The entire country, 1 in 5 in the entire country will be over 65. That's something that's going to require a complete overhaul of our healthcare system. And I don't think any amount of money coming out of the sky will allow us to use our current way, current methods, current paradigm model of delivering care to address this population, which some of us are part of. So that brings me to the question of what's patients' role? Well, in the past, patients, and on paper, there's really no information transfer. That's a combination of data about yourself or the knowledge to do something about it. In the electronic world, we can do something about that. But I think the way to scale this problem is to put more data, knowledge, and tools in the hands of patients and their surrounding caregivers. Most often, that's a family member. Whether it's our generation taking care of our parents or the other way around. There are a lot of people that are involved in an individual's health. We just have not empowered them with information at all. As one estimate goes, about $350 billion, so that is real money, even in the $2.5 trillion industry, goes towards the caregiver, this uncompensated care. So we've stripped that resources out of society, and they do that in an uncompensated way because they love their individual, but we have not empowered in society. My profession has not empowered these folks with information to be able to be effective and efficient with their time. So I think that part of the answer, potentially a major part of the answer of how do we scale up to handle the baby boomer age tsunami, is to empower patients and their caregivers with information and the tools needed. That's definitely going to be involve devices. And that's why I'm not as pessimistic about the overall role, either of devices or healthcare professionals. All of us are going to be disrupted. But if we don't start now figuring out how to take care of this, take care in a new way and in a new reimbursement system, we won't get there. So I think the challenge is now, and I think that's what Obama meant when by putting healthcare as one of his top domestic agenda items, is because it primarily affects the health of the country. It also affects the economy. And right now we do not have a way, we don't have a public policy that directs us and all the resources in the United States in the direction that's going to solve this problem. I think we have a way to start shifting the policy directions, and I think the resourcefulness of the U.S. will follow. It'll involve all of the kinds of technologies that are present here on stage. But patients are going to be key. So we have to figure out how to get patients the information, the knowledge, the tools, the devices, and the pharmaceuticals to make health better.
Great. Your point about, not as pessimistic, let's talk about some optimistic viewpoints here that provide some balance. And so I want to leave time for questions, so I'll throw this out to all three. I'd like your impressions on, who do you think is really going to stand to gain from the healthcare reform bill? And, just your views from each of your perspectives, if there's any obvious people that, will gain, whether it's companies, industries, that type. And Dave, we'll start with you, and we can get an answer from everybody, and then I think we'll open it up for questions to the audience.
Sure. So the first group to gain will be people who are not covered now and who will receive substantial subsidies from the government to buy health insurance. And depending on how you count, that could be as many as 30 million people in the next 3 or 4 years. The second group who will gain will be Medicare beneficiaries. The drug benefit is being increased, and they won't have that famous donut hole anymore, so that they will be better off. If you look at what the market has said that the insurance industry is going to be better off. All the stocks of the WellPoints and Blues and so forth have done better since the passage of the bill. So even though perhaps the margins may shrink for some of the companies at the expansion, coverage will add millions and tens of millions of new customers.
I have a simple, I honestly believe we're all going to benefit from this. I mentioned before their own study that uninsurance is a shared destiny. And I see from the health professional side, clearly we shift costs around and we add costs by not giving people access to health and health care. I'll pick on another example in the meaningful use provision that you mentioned. So you think of this as software for the providers, whether they're physicians or hospitals. The way we put together the framework for how you qualify for this money, there were 5 categories, 4 clinical and 1 foundational. So one was you must prove that you improve the quality, safety, efficiency of healthcare and reduce the healthcare disparities. That seems fairly obvious. The second one was, it must engage patients and their families. So interestingly, the providers of healthcare, the professional team behind the scenes, must provide data back to the patients in order to qualify for that money. That, I think, is transformative along the ways that I mentioned before. Patients and their families have to be part of this solution, and they've been denied access to their information. In order for the healthcare professionals to get access to this incentive dollars, they must share the information with the patients. So that is a critical piece. Again, this goes back to the Recovery Act, but that's on the road to reform. That's, I think, going to be transformative, and that opens up a whole new world for all of the parties, the patients, the providers of information technology, the providers of devices, et cetera. But I think then, at least the bottom line, the patients and the communities have the most to gain from this.
Okay, Tom?
I think a lot of the patients are going to be affected by some of the changes in insurance regulations. The one I always think of is pre-existing conditions. That was a setback for a lot of, for me personally with a lot of my family, but also a good portion of the population that were affected by these kind of draconian rules and regulations that were implemented by the insurance providers. But again, I think having 30 million more on the rolls, having 30 million more people have access to healthcare cannot be viewed as anything but optimistic.
Great. Well, we'd like to, open it up to questions to the audience. I know there's a number. We'll start right here. Right up here in front.
Thanks again. A question for, I guess, Dr. Tang. You said a couple of times that the patients and their personal caregivers need to have access to information. And Tracy, you said very rightly that physicians, at least, not the grand hospitals, but the physicians, small practices, are absolutely legals in information system. And in my doctor's office, they still have good old files, filing cabinets, and the screen with green letters on it. So in all this, grand scheme of things, who, how, and how are we going to get to the level whereby all of these people will be fully connected? I've seen my software or a physician being able to touch on screen, and then all the data will nicely flow. It's available everywhere, ubiquitously protected, and so forth. But so you're on a gap between the reality and the dream. So can somebody address that particular piece?
So there's definitely a gap, and I think this almost $30 billion of incentive, which is 2 orders of magnitude more than we've ever had in the past, is part of it. So one, there is this direct financial incentive, and for physicians, it's $44,000. If you're a Medicaid provider, it could be $64,000. So we're talking real money. We're not talking 1,000, a few thousand, which just didn't move the industry. We're talking real money, a substantial amount of what it would cost you to implement. So that's already a game changer. There's another $2 billion in addition to the Medicare, Medicaid incentive that goes into infrastructure. And you mentioned the small provider, which is definitely a big gap for us right now. They're following the agricultural model. There's something called Regional Extension Center. So throughout the states, so throughout the country, there are going to be centers that help, and their charge is to help smaller practices, whether it's the physicians or the hospitals, implement this stuff to get their meaningful use incentive money. In addition, we all know that it's one thing to buy a fax machine, it's another to have other fax machines to talk to. So that's health information exchange. That doesn't happen naturally, because nobody wants to pay for the interstate, but they all want to drive on the interstate. So that clearly is a public good. So it's a clear role for the federal government to say, I've got to help paint this infrastructure. And in fact, a large amount of money, about $600 million, is going to help do that. That doesn't pay for it all, but it primarily helps give states the ability to organize communities and stakeholders so that this road can be paved. Another thing that comes out is clearly with all this implementation going on, we don't have the workforce to do that. So it keeps trickling down. So there's a chunk of money to build up in the community colleges and universities to help train both people who are providing care as well as people who have to implement these things. So as you can tell, there's a lot of programs that are part of this broad umbrella of the High Tech Act that are out to try to help everyone, including the last mile kind of things, including the smaller practices. It's going to take effort it's going to take more than money, clearly, but it's quite amazing how comprehensive the program is. And it's all pretty much administered out of the Office of National Coordinator and CMS in terms of getting this money out.
Is there a mandatory date by which the small providers are complying with technology?
So I think I heard the question is it mandatory? Well, the way we make things mandatory in this country is you use the money. So the carrot follows first. The 44,000, the 64,000 comes first. So up through year 2014, you can earn these carrots. Now 2014, there's two reasons for 2014. One is Obama established set as a goal that all of our records are in electronic form by 2014. So in a sense, the legislation was built around that. What I mean by that is you can collect incentive money up to 2014. After 2014, i.e. starting with 2015, no longer can you collect incentive money, but you're going to start paying a penalty. So your reimbursement for Medicare and Medicaid will go down for physicians, for example, initially 1% in 2015, 2% in 2016, and so on and so forth. So there is the big carrot followed by a persistent stick built into the legislation. The other reason in my mind for the 2014 date is current projections, just the way we're spending money now. By 2017, the Medicare Trust Fund goes broke. So we have no system. So when people push back on saying this is really an aggressive program, this 2014 and 2015, I said it's built in with the constraints of where we are with today's healthcare delivery system. We don't have the money after 2017 to take care of folks over 65, and all of us are going to reach that point sometime in our life. And so, in a sense, we do already have a crisis. It just wasn't visible enough. So the legislation is actually helping to say, okay, we have this, we're going to put in the carrots and sticks to try to move people faster. So I hope that addresses your question.
Next question.
No, this is a related question. The meaningful use in final documents just came out. They were considered too much, too fast. You talked about why it has to be that way, but it's a two-part question. First off, what has changed that you think makes it more doable? I know that CMS listened to lots of the feedback that a number of us gave, but what do you think is the most important change in that? And then the second is, can you comment on what the government infrastructure is going to be needed to actually audit and measure and monitor meaningful use, because it is kind of groundbreaking in the IT world to measure results and not just effort.
Good questions. So first, the too much too fast. It's like complaining about life is just too fast. So in a sense, we have this baby boomer generation coming. We have the financial collapse of the ways we pay for it in current time. That's life dictating to us. We have a problem, we have to solve it. The great part about this country is we not only have the resource, but we have the resourcefulness to solve this, I believe. So I think we can, once we get our, final rule, now that we have the rule, now that we understand the facts, we just have to go deal with it, and I think we can. What changed from between the NPRM, the notice of proposed rulemaking, and the final rule? A lot. Interesting enough, the matrix. So I served as the chair of the Meaningful Use Work Group and the vice chair of the faculty committee called HIT Policy Committee that advises HHS. And the framework that I described, putting the health outcomes first, survived, I think, in great form, and the objectives survived. What changed, and I think appropriately so, is that they added flexibility. And the biggest flexibility is, it used to be an all or nothing. You had to do all of these things, or you got no money. Now they do arrange, they call it a menu set. So there's some things everybody has to do, and there's some things you get to make a choice, at least in, quote, stage one. They signal that in stage 2, which is 2 years, in 2013, then you'll have to fill out the rest of that menu. So I think the biggest thing is to, one, lower the threshold. So that, just to explain, if you had a set of objectives, you had to meet that at 10 or 20 or 30%. Before it was 80%. They backed out down on the threshold, and they also came up with this menu selection set. So I think those are important differences from the NPRM, and that helps people, give people a bit more time. But I think the clock we're racing against is the 2017, not just the legislation.
Next question.
Hi, I have sort of a three-headed question about privacy and security. what is the key concept in getting around whatever assumption there might be that the kind of widespread national access that is implied in a data exchange is not a complete trade-off with privacy and security? Number two is, I hope it's not too pessimistic to say that there's going to be a huge data leak at some point, just because that seems to be the way of the world. Is there any way to anticipate what the impact of that will be politically and policy-wise when it's on Good Morning America and people are freaking out about their sex habits being exposed to I don't know who, and or their DNA or whatever it is. And number three is how does this play into behavioral targeting? There's got to be an enormous incentive on the part of all sorts of providers to send me personalized messages about my performance in bed last night, and a great deal of information available to them. And again, that's maybe related to the other question about the data breach.
Okay, so I think unless he produces something, we're not going to know about your performance in bed. So just to take care of question 3 first. Privacy and security is of the 5 categories I mentioned. I said 4 clinical and 1 foundational. That's the foundational one. Nothing will move, nothing will improve if we don't have trust on both the patient side and the provider side. So, in fact, there's currently a work group we call the Tiger Team working on privacy and security just to handle some of these tough, challenging, but foundational issues that you raised. So clearly, when it goes out of paper, now interestingly enough, so when it leaves paper and goes electronic, yes, it can be distributed. By the way, the number one reason why it would be useful to have it distributed is because you'd actually like your data to follow you wherever you get care. So that's a good thing. But we have to watch out for the bad apples as well, as you point out. Interestingly, on paper, it just wasn't that secure. So an anecdote is on paper, so there was a university where somebody made a complaint about ambulance chasers. Basically, they were solicited by somebody because somebody obviously knew a piece of their medical record, a piece of their medical history. But it was done on paper. That organization was on paper, so they could never track down the perpetrator. In another university where they did have an electronic record system, a female resident complained because somebody else knew that she was pregnant. They got that person. Why? Because of the audit trails and electronic health record system. So when you have auditability and accountability, then you can enforce it, and all of a sudden, at least the consequences, the penalties for violating these privacy rules is increased. So that's on the enforcement side. But in general, we've been very proactive. So there's HIPAA. I think you all know about that. That legislation, I think, significantly increased the complexity and confusion, but it also significantly on net improved the privacy awareness of all of folks. Now you go into medical school thinking that you should watch out for people's privacy, but this really did raise the bar on that discussion. The HITECH Act actually increased the penalties and increased the reach of HIPAA in terms of who can the government go after when you violate someone's privacy. You saw that California actually increased that just in last year, and already their organizations have paid $500,000 in fines just in the first year alone. So the society is sensitive to this issue, and there are laws that help back up the catching people and enforcing and punishing people, and that has to be commensurate with our ability to exchange information. You point out the risk. It's not, and people are clearly not ignoring this. And it's, as I said, there's a Tiger Team to deal with some of these new issues that didn't exist on paper.
And how does this play into behavioral targeting of, I guess not just of patients, but of any intermediaries and any providers in the system as well? You're taking this, there's got to be a huge financial incentive to take more or less sensitive information. And I put it sort of jocularly, but this could apply to any sort of inferred or known medical condition. I think there has to be a huge incentive to target people with that sensitive information. So how does that issue play?
Well, in HIPAA, the covered entity, so the issue with HIPAA, so this is the privacy law, or at least the privacy part of HIPAA, is that it only applies to 3 classes of organizations: of individuals. One is the provider of care, you recognize them, physicians, hospitals, pharmacies, et cetera. Two, the payers for care, at least the intermediary payers, the insurance companies, because they have to get that to adjudicate the claim. And three, a group that is called clearinghouse that sort of passes information in between. The important point of that is, and no other organization is covered. So the things that you were worried about, covered entities, people covered under HIPAA can't do. But if, and there are different ways, including the ways you answer surveys on the web, that other people can get sensitive information, those folks are not covered by HIPAA. So that's just a bit of a buyer beware kind of a thing. But the providers are really covered quite well under the current legislation.
Next question.
My company actually has been approved to implement these small systems at the physicians. And it's interesting from what I can learn, the big guys, the Stanfords, the Kaisers, they've already pretty much are way down the trail. Somebody who's not big enough to have an IT person in their group it's pretty difficult just to get to that doctor, to get him to make a decision, even though there is this 44,000 and 64,000. I'm wondering, at the end of the day, how important are all of these small doctors, and is anybody actually keeping track of that piece? And has somebody figured out a way to get to the doctor who doesn't have time for his patients, let alone an IT situation?
So that's a good question. It was like the first question. There are programs to help the smaller practitioners. Professional societies, the one I belong to, is the American College of Physicians, have put out a website to help doctors in smaller practices compare the different products and rate them, et cetera. So there are folks trying to address this problem. It's not easy, but there are things being done to try to help that. And are we tracking it? Yes. So we actually, so the HIT Policy Committee, one of our subcommittees on certification and adoption, are looking to have ongoing surveillance on, well, are these EHRs getting out there and are they getting implemented? So we're trying to track. So here's the policy. How's the industry reacting? And then are there any mid-course corrections we can do to make it faster and apply to more people?
We have time for one more question.
So, I've spent a long time, a lot of consulting days, or other people's consulting money. No, I actually get a return. Bringing private sector approaches to public sector information technology utilization and healthcare utilization. For example, the Kaiser's National Clinical Information System. And so when I hear the government spending billions of dollars to help private sector IT get off the ground, first I panic, and then I say, why isn't the government, if you want, there are a plethora of online tools that small providers could, for $44,000, actually implement quite effectively. But why is the government not taking an approach similar to what banking and retail did in terms of the private sector developing the interconnections like electronic data exchanges? Why is it that the government feels with 900 systems at Social Security and Medicare today that do not talk to each other, are they the example we want to follow?
So I want to make sure I clarify when I say we and in my role. So when I say we, I'm talking about the HIT Policy Committee largely. And that is a FACT committee, Federal Advisory Committee. We're not the government. We're set up by the statute to advise the government, and the government doesn't have to, they can listen to whatever they want or not listen to. So I just want to clarify that, so I'm not representing the government. I can give my personal opinion on what you said. One is, my personal opinion is we are one of the most behind in computerizing our healthcare system of all the developed countries. And we have a lot to show for it. In other words, we are way behind in our health status indicators. And I think the two may be related. So that, to me, says that we have a market failure. I also know from just whatever business you're in, you can't either measure or improve anything without the information. That seems like at face value, that's just a no-brainer. So clearly, if the market has failed, and one of the big reasons the market has failed is because this chicken and egg, nobody wants the system, so nobody's producing the appropriate system. And the $44,000, I think, addresses a big part of it. And the other programs I talked about. And finally, there may be 900 systems advertised. I'm almost positive 900 systems cannot help providers achieve meaningful use. That's a big thing. There's plenty of things you can download. Can you improve the health outcomes of the country or individuals? And the answer is no. And a lot of the things that have come down here, including certification criteria, I think will move us more in that direction.
Well, I think this is a topic I know we could talk about for hours. I think there were a number of other questions that I know didn't get answered. I would encourage you, the panelists may be here for a few moments after the panel. If there's something that you would like to know, take advantage of that. I would like to thank the panel for the time that they've spent preparing and coming. And also thank the Churchill Club for providing the venue for meaningful discussion here about healthcare reform. Karen?
Thank you, Tracy, very much, and thank you again to our panelists for sharing your perspectives and for stimulating a very good discussion. I'd like to thank our sponsors again, Wells Fargo Insurance Services, Wells Fargo Growth Technology Group, and of course our host, Fenwick & West, and thank all of you for coming. Have a wonderful morning.
Hey, how's it going? Doing well. Nice to see you. That's good. Yeah. Surprisingly busy. That's the problem.
Hi, Tom White and I. How are you? You doing well? Wells Fargo. On the insurance side, yeah, I'm on the commercial insurance side. Thank you. What do you do, Tom? It's all commercial insurance, so I don't, yeah. It's all. I see it's working.
There's so many questions there. It's like,